Clint Eastwood, Hollywood legend, director, and a man known for his no-nonsense attitude. But when a group of thieves sets their sights on his luxurious estate, they have no idea who they're dealing with. As they break in under the cover of darkness, expecting an easy score, they soon realize they've made a grave mistake. What unfolds next is a real-life moment straight out of an action thriller. How does Eastwood respond? And what lesson do these criminals learn the hard way? Stay tuned as we reveal the shocking truth behind this daring home invasion. Before we get into today's story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's get started. The night was unnervingly still, save for the occasional rustling of leaves carried by the gentle California breeze. Clint Eastwood's luxurious estate, perched atop a secluded hill, stood as a silent fortress against the moonlit sky. The grand, rustic architecture, stone pillars, large wooden beams, and wide glass windows blended into the landscape, exuding a quiet strength, much like the man himself. Inside, the faint aroma of old leather and aged whiskey lingered in the air. Clint sat in his study, flipping through a script with practiced ease, yet his mind wandered. The warm glow of his desk lamp cast elongated shadows against the walls lined with framed movie posters and hard-earned accolades. He had built this life from nothing. Every success, every battle won, every role played had led him here. But something still gnawed at him, an unease he couldn't quite shake. Maybe it was the weight of time. The silence of the house, once comforting, now felt cavernous. The echoes of the past crept in, the early struggles, the fights to be taken seriously, the doubters who swore he'd never make it. He had proven them all wrong. And yet, as he stared at his reflection in the polished surface of his desk, he couldn't ignore the thought that had been plaguing him for months. Have I done enough? A distant howl of a coyote cut through the silence. Clint exhaled, rubbing a calloused hand over his jaw. The stillness of the night was deceptive. He had lived long enough to recognize when something felt off. His instincts, honed from years in Hollywood and an even rougher youth, tingled with an unspoken warning. Outside, beyond the sprawling lawn and towering iron gates, shadows lurked just out of sight. The thieves had chosen their target carefully, believing that an aging movie star in his 80s was just another easy mark. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly anticipate, was that Clint Eastwood had spent his entire life defying expectations. And tonight would be no different. The silence shattered. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, gravel, crunching beneath careful footsteps. Clint Eastwood's sharp eyes lifted from the script in his hand. He listened. Years of honed instincts told him this was no coyote, no restless branch swaying in the wind. This was deliberate, calculated. His mind worked fast. Could be a lost hiker, a kid messing around. But deep down, he knew better. The way the sound moved, slow, methodical, meant only one thing. Someone didn't want to be heard. With a measured breath, Clint reached for the small pistol he kept in his desk drawer. It was an old habit, a remnant of a time when survival meant being prepared for anything. He didn't need it often, but something in his gut told him this was one of those nights. A faint beep, then another. The security system. Someone was tampering with the lock on the back entrance. Clint stood, his jaw tightening. His pulse remained steady, not from arrogance, but from experience. He had been in high-stakes situations before, both on and off the screen. This was no movie set, no second takes. Then, click. The door gave way. His grip on the pistol tightened. He moved with careful, practiced ease, his steps silent as he navigated the familiar darkness of his home. A low whisper. Footsteps. More than one. Through the dim light, filtering from the hallway, Clint saw them. 3 figures, clad in black, moving through his living room like shadows. One held a crowbar, the other a duffel bag. The third was scanning the room. Clearly the lookout. Clint narrowed his eyes. Idiots. They had no idea whose house they had just walked into. The leader, a burly man with tattoos peeking from his sleeves, motioned toward the staircase. Upstairs. Fast. Grab the safe. His voice was barely audible, but carried the weight of confidence. Someone who had done this before. Clint finally spoke, his voice calm, measured. You boys lost? The reaction was instant. The thieves froze, heads snapping toward the source of the voice. For a moment, there was stunned silence. Then, the one with the crowbar swore under his breath. What the... Clint took a step forward, emerging from the shadows. The dim light caught his face, deep lines carved by time and experience. His piercing gaze locked onto the intruders, unwavering. The leader regained his composure first. Old man, you really don't want to do this? Clint tilted his head, expression unreadable. You're in my house, son. I think that means you don't want to do this. The man with the crowbar shifted uneasily. Come on, let's just grab what we need and go. The leader wasn't so quick to back down. He took a step forward, puffing up his chest. Listen, Grandpa, just sit down and no one gets hurt. Clint sighed, shaking his head. Wrong move. Before the man could process what was happening, Clint acted. Decisive. Controlled. A lifetime of discipline in one swift movement. And in that moment, the thieves realized, far too late, that they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The silence in the room stretched tight, thick with tension. The intruders stood frozen, their confidence wavering under Clint Eastwood's unflinching stare. They had expected an easy score, an old man asleep in his luxurious home, an unguarded fortune waiting to be taken. What they hadn't counted on was him. The leader, a man named Ray, clenched his jaw. He had done this before, broken into dozens of homes, taken what he wanted without consequence. But something about this moment felt different. The way Clint stood, unshaken, unimpressed, was unsettling. Ray glanced at his crew. What are you waiting for? Grab what you can. But his men hesitated. Even they could sense it now. Something was off. Clint's voice, low and even, cut through the tension. You sure you want to do that, son? The man with the crowbar, a lanky thug named Jesse, tightened his grip, trying to mask his nerves. We got the numbers, old man. Just stay put, and you won't get hurt. Clint exhaled slowly. He had spent years perfecting the art of patience, of controlled action. But patience had its limits. His eyes flicked toward the nearest threat. Jesse. The kid held the crowbar like a weapon, but his stance was all wrong. Too stiff, too uncertain. He was no fighter. In a flash, Clint moved. A swift step forward, a calculated strike. He grabbed Jesse's wrist, twisting it with practiced ease. The crowbar clattered to the floor as Jesse yelped in pain. Ray's eyes widened. What the hell? Before he could react, Clint turned, using Jesse's body as a shield. The second thug, a bald, stocky man named Vince, lunged forward, swinging wildly. Clint dodged, his movements fluid, precise. Ray finally snapped out of his shock, reaching into his waistband for a weapon. Clint's voice stopped him cold. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Ray hesitated. Clint's piercing gaze locked onto him, unwavering. This isn't just some old man, Ray realized. This is someone who's been through hell and walked out the other side. Vince groaned, clutching his arm where Clint had landed a precise strike. Jesse scrambled back, cradling his wrist. You boys aren't very good at this, Clint muttered. Ray's mind raced. This was supposed to be easy. They had timed it perfectly, picked a quiet, secluded house. No security guards, no neighbors nearby. How did it go so wrong so fast? Desperation flickered in Ray's eyes. We ain't leaving empty-handed. Clint tilted his head. I don't think you'll be leaving at all. The tension snapped. Ray lunged, but Clint was faster. He sidestepped, sending Ray stumbling forward. Before the thug could recover, Clint delivered a precise, forceful strike to his ribs. Ray gasped, dropping to his knees. Jesse scrambled for the crowbar, but Clint was already there, kicking it aside. That's enough. His voice was firm, commanding. You boys have two choices. Walk out that door and pray I don't call the cops, or keep pushing your luck. Vince wiped blood from his lip, glaring. You think we're scared of you? Clint took a slow step forward. Number, I think you should be. For a long, heavy moment, no one moved. Then, Ray coughed, struggling to his feet. He shot Clint a venomous glare, but took a shaky step back. Let's go, he muttered to his crew. Jesse and Vince hesitated before following him toward the door. Clint stood motionless, watching them go. He knew their type, arrogant, reckless, but also cowards at their core. Ray paused at the threshold, turning back. This ain't over. Clint's lips curled into something between a smirk and a warning. For your sake, son, I hope it is. With that, the thieves disappeared into the night, regret hanging heavy in the air. The distant hum of the retreating car faded into the night. But Clint Eastwood stood unmoving, his sharp eyes fixed on the empty road beyond his gate. Something gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. Then, a flicker of movement. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch the shadow slipping back onto his property. I knew it. Ray, the young punk, had doubled back, slipping through the side of the house like a rat looking for scraps. The others had left, but Ray wasn't walking away empty-handed. He was too stubborn, too reckless. Clint exhaled slowly. He had seen this kind of stupidity before. Men who didn't know when to quit, who let their pride lead them straight into the fire. A quiet creak. Then, a flash of steel. A knife. Ray lunged, the blade aimed for Clint's ribs, wild and desperate, but Clint wasn't there. In a blur, he pivoted, sidestepping the attack with effortless precision. Ray stumbled forward, momentarily off balance. One opening. That's all it takes. Clint seized his wrist, twisting it sharply. The knife tumbled from Ray's grip, clattering against the floor. With a single, fluid motion, Clint drove the younger man backward, pinning him against the wall. For the first time that night, real fear flickered in Ray's eyes. Clint didn't speak right away. He just held the kid there, his grip firm but controlled. His breathing was steady, his heart rate barely elevated. He had been through worse. Ray, on the other hand, was trembling. You don't get it, do you? Clint finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost tired. Ray swallowed hard, but his bravado cracked. I just... His words trailed off, his mind scrambling for an excuse. Clint's grip loosened just slightly, enough to let Ray feel his own weakness. What were you going to do, son? Stab me? Kill me for a few watches and some loose cash? Ray's lips parted, but no words came. His breath hitched. Then, Clint saw it. The truth. This wasn't just about a robbery gone wrong. This was something deeper, something that had driven Ray to come back, even when he had a chance to walk away. Desperation. Clint glanced at the knife on the ground. It was cheap, dull, not the weapon of a seasoned criminal, more like the weapon of a scared kid trying to convince himself he was tough. "You weren't going to do it, were you?" Clint murmured. Ray shook his head, barely noticeable. Clint exhaled, stepping back. "Get out of here." Ray hesitated, confused by the unexpected mercy. He rubbed his sore wrist, looking anywhere but at Clint. Why aren't you calling the cops?" Clint studied him for a long moment before answering. "Because I've been where you are." Ray's breath caught in his throat. Clint's voice remained steady, but there was something beneath it, something raw. "When you're young, you think you got no choice. You tell yourself the world's stacked against you, that the only way out is to take what you can." His eyes darkened. "That kind of thinking gets men killed." Ray looked away, shame creeping in. "I know you don't believe me now," Clint continued, "but one day you will." A long silence stretched between them. Ray swallowed hard, nodding once, before turning toward the door. He paused at the threshold, gripping the frame like it was the only thing keeping him standing. I don't know what I'm doing anymore," he admitted in a quiet voice. Clint nodded. "Then figure it out, before it's too late." Ray lingered for a moment longer, then disappeared into the night. Clint exhaled, finally allowing the weight of the evening to settle. His hand instinctively traced the faint scar on his knuckle, a reminder of a time when he had been the one making the wrong choices. Tonight, he had seen himself in that kid, and that scared him more than any knife ever could. Clint stood in the quiet of his dimly lit hallway, the echoes of the night still settling in his bones. The house, once invaded by chaos, now felt eerily still. He glanced at the discarded knife on the floor, the same weapon that had nearly turned this night into something far worse. He bent down, picking it up with slow, deliberate movements. The handle was rough, the blade dull. A weapon wielded by someone who had never truly fought for survival before, someone who had only just begun to understand what real desperation felt like. Clint sighed and set the knife down on the table beside him. As he did, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Everything all right?" Maggie, his housekeeper and longtime friend, peeked around the corner, her face lined with concern. She had been with Clint for years, tending to his home with the same quiet strength she had always carried. "Yeah," Clint muttered, running a hand through his hair. "It's over." Maggie stepped closer, eyeing him carefully. "What happened?" Clint let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Some kids thought they could take from me." His voice grew quieter. "One of them stayed behind." Maggie frowned. "Stayed behind?" Clint nodded. "Came back. Wanted more." He paused, exhaling. "Or maybe he just didn't know how to stop." Maggie studied him for a moment, then crossed her arms. "And?" Clint turned toward the window, watching the dark street where Ray had disappeared. The kid was long gone now, but something about that final exchange lingered in his mind. "And I let him go." Maggie's expression softened, but she said nothing. She just waited, giving Clint space to speak. Clint leaned against the wall, his voice quieter now. He wasn't a killer. Not yet. He thought back to the way Ray had trembled, the way his voice had cracked. I saw myself in him. Maggie's brows knit together. Clint, he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I know what you're thinking. He could have hurt me. He could have come back again. He paused. But I also know what it's like to stand on the edge of something you can't take back. Maggie's face softened. And you think you pulled him back? Clint let out a breath. I don't know. A silence stretched between them. Finally, Maggie spoke, her voice gentle. You did what you thought was right. Clint nodded, though the weight in his chest remained. He turned back toward the table, his eyes falling on the knife again. A relic of the night's events, a reminder. He picked it up, gripping it for a long moment before walking to the back door. The cool night air hit him as he stepped outside, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. With a final glance toward the empty street, Clint threw the knife into the distance, letting it disappear into the dark. Then, without another word, he turned back inside, locking the door behind him. He wasn't sure if Ray would ever find his way, but tonight, Clint had made sure the kids still had a chance, and maybe that was enough. A week had passed since that night, yet Clint still found himself staring out toward the long road leading away from his home. He didn't expect Ray to return, not in the way those thieves had come, desperate and reckless. But something about the encounter had shifted something deep within him. For decades, Clint had lived by a simple code. The world was harsh, and a man had to be harder. It had kept him alive. It had built his legacy. But now, standing on his front porch, coffee cooling in his hand, he realized that toughness alone wasn't what had saved him that night. It was restraint. It was mercy. He had seen the fear in Ray's eyes, the way his hands shook when faced with the consequences of his choices. And for the first time in a long while, Clint had chosen to believe that maybe not everyone was too far gone. The sound of gravel crunching beneath tires pulled him from his thoughts. A delivery truck rolled up his driveway, stopping just short of the house. The driver, a young man with a wary glance, stepped out and lifted a small brown package from the back. You Eastwood? Clint smirked, setting his coffee down. Last time I checked. The driver hesitated, then handed him the package. Someone paid cash. No return address. Clint frowned, but took the box. The truck rumbled away as he turned it over in his hands, then peeled back the tape. Inside, resting against brown paper, was something unexpected. A small, leather-bound book. He lifted it out, flipping open the cover. The pages were filled with notes, messy handwriting, scribbled thoughts, words scratched out and rewritten. It wasn't until he reached the third page that he saw it. Thank you. 2 simple words, written in careful, deliberate strokes. No signature. But Clint didn't need one. He exhaled, shaking his head as a quiet chuckle escaped his lips. He didn't know if this meant Ray had truly changed. Didn't know if the kid was on a better path. But he did know this. Something had shifted. Maybe not just in Ray, maybe in himself too. Clint tucked the book under his arm, stepping back inside. The world was still harsh. But today, for the first time in a long time, he felt something else. Hope. Some moments change us forever. That night wasn't just about a failed robbery. It was about choices, second chances, and the power of restraint. Clint Eastwood had every reason to strike back, to make an example out of those who dared invade his home. But instead, he let something far stronger guide him. Wisdom. It's easy to believe that toughness is about fighting back, but sometimes true strength is knowing when to hold back. when to show mercy, when to believe that even the lost can find their way back. So now, we ask you, what would you have done in Clint's shoes? Do you believe people can truly change, or are some beyond redemption? Let's discuss in the comments. What's your take on second chances?